Bhadram karneभिः शृणुयाम देवाः Bhadram pasya makshabhirjajatraः Sthirairangayestuashtubhagum sastanubhih Vishima devahitam yadayuh Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. May we hear with our ears what is auspicious. May we see with our eyes what is auspicious. Tranquil in body and mind, may we spend our lifetime for God realization and for doing good to humanity. Peace, peace, peace be unto all. Friends, I am extremely happy to introduce to you this evening Dr. Huston Smith. Many of you know him personally. He is a well-known professor of religion and philosophy and a wonderful writer. As a part of the Golden Jubilee of the Vedanta Society of St. Louis, he will be with us today and tomorrow. Tonight, he will tell us about his quest in world religions. Many of his students and friends, and including myself, we want to know about his adventure in world religions. He was born in China. He was very much well-versed both in the Eastern and Western thought. Very few people you will find like him at present. And we wanted to know about from him that how he made those great religious teachers, Dalai Lama, Suzuki, many people. And we want to get some of those wisdom from him. We shall find, in Dr. Smith's writing, the wisdom of China, Japan, India, Persia, among the Sufis, as well as Judeo-Christian traditions of Europe and America. As bees gather honey from different flowers and make the honeycomb, and human beings enjoy that honey. Similarly, Dr. Smith collected wisdom from all over the world and put those wisdoms in his famous book, Religions of Man, which is a very popular and famous book. And we shall get some of his wisdom tonight. So the topic of Dr. Smith tonight is My Quest for World Religions. Before I ask Dr. Smith to speak to you, only a couple of announcements I must make. Tomorrow at 10:30 a.m., Dr. Smith will speak on religion of the 21st century. He is a great thinker, and he can see what type of religion is coming in the 21st century. We like to hear from him. Secondly, at 7:30 p.m. tomorrow evening at CBC High School Auditorium, there will be a symposium. Different world religions, leaders of different world religions will speak, and he will be the chairperson. He will speak later, Are the World Religions Contradictory? That would be his subject tomorrow evening. Tomorrow evening, 7:30 p.m. at CBC High School Auditorium. Tomorrow at 10:30 a.m. in this chapel, he will speak on religion of the 21st century. And I shall introduce him officially and elaborately tomorrow. We are thinking to get him informally this night. So after his talk, you are requested to ask him questions. He will be glad to talk to you. Thank you. Dr. Smith.
So many familiar friends from past years. Since my own hearing has begun to decline, I'm sensitive on the subject, and let me ask, at this voice level, can you hear me in the back? If anyone has any problem at any point, just give me a signal, and despite being a teacher, I won't call on you. I'll just know what is happening. It's a great joy to be here this evening and to have a small part in this 50th anniversary of the founding of the Vedanta Society of St. Louis, and to pay in this way an homage to my own revered teacher, Swami Satprakashananda. I'm very pleased with this topic that I've been asked to speak on tonight, my quest for the world's religions, because in a very real way they began right here in St. Louis. Actually, not exactly here. It was the apartment on Delmar Avenue at that point. But the part that Swami Satprakashananda played in launching me onto this path was decisive. Now, Swami has mentioned some names, and I have been very fortunate. He mentioned the Dalai Lama, Daisetsu Suzuki, Thomas Merton, and I'm glad that there is to be a question period, because if you wish to ask anything about those laudable persons, feel free to. I had not thought that I would center my talk on these personages, but I'll be glad to allude to my experiences with them if you wish. I'm also glad that you said tonight is informal. It will be a kind of travelogue, a personal travelogue through these great religions. And let me just start out by saying that of the ones, the major historical traditions, I like to think of them as the wisdom traditions of the world. The 7 that are covered in the religions of man. I shall not be speaking about Christianity, even though that was the tradition into which I was born and still formally remain. Not, you know, out of any disrespect, but simply we're familiar with that. Nor will I speak about Judaism, though one of our daughters married an Orthodox Jew, and we have a grandson named Isaiah. It's simply because the time is such that I'm going to pass over what's nearer at hand and deal with the rest of the world. Finally, I'll not be saying anything about China, even though that was the land of my origin, and a good bit of China got into me during those 17 years. But for most of my academic career, China was closed to Americans. So only once have I been back, though 2 days ago I received an invitation to Beijing, a small conference on religion in China. And I look forward very much in May to sitting down with 6 Chinese scholars and 6 of us from the West to discuss what is happening on religion in China today. For time reasons, I'm not going to speak to those. And that leaves the Vedanta, Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, and I'm going to add one that came into my horizon since that book was written, namely the Native American tradition, as an instance of a whole religious world that is not touched in that book. That book deals with the historical religions, but the tribal religions, the oral religions, were not included. And yet I've come to see in those two a very wonderful outreaching of the human spirit towards the divine. Now, my problem is going to be not to talk too long, so I've imposed on myself a discipline, with the exception of the Vedanta, which I shall begin with. I'm going to, in respect to the others, limit myself to one important insight that broke over me as I went into the study of that tradition. Now, let me back up for a moment and just say how I got into this course of exploration. I came, as I've said, to the United States from China, and immediately I was caught up in the dynamism of the West. I came thinking that I was simply coming for my theological credentials and would go straight back to China as a missionary, because I was brought up in a town where we were the only American. So I had only one male white role model, my father. And I assumed that that's what American men were. They were missionaries. So I was going to follow in that path, no question about it. But when I arrived in the United States, the dynamism of the West just swept me up and took over. Never mind that it happened to be Fayette, Missouri, population 3,000, Central Methodist College, enrollment 600. Nevertheless, compared with Podunk, China, it was the big time and the bright lights. And I was a young man, and it was not more, I would expect, than 2 weeks. Then China had become a happy memory, but my future was going to be where the action was, namely with the West. So, though my undergraduate was in religion, set in place when I thought I was going to be a missionary, but I just moved that over. I'd be a minister. I wanted to stay with the West, not a missionary. But then when I went on to graduate school, actually the last year or two in college, ideas suddenly took over. And so when I went on to the University of Chicago for graduate work, I moved yet another step next door from missionary to minister to a teacher. Now, my interests throughout were in the intersection between religion and philosophy. But entirely, this is my point, entirely regarding the West. I had, by requirement, to take one course on world religions at both the undergraduate and the graduate level. They were the dullest courses in the entire curriculum. In fact, looking back on it, it is a wonder to me how those teachers were able to conceal from us students the wealth in those traditions. They must have been kind of inverse geniuses of some sort to be able to do that. Well, actually, the reason is well known, I think is obvious. They had no interest in them themselves. They taught these simply as museum pieces of what people thought way back then. Anyway, my point was I went right through to within 6 months of my doctorate with zero interest in world religion. Totally the West. That's where it was. And I still remember the very night when this whole thing changed. I was out in Berkeley writing a dissertation on value theory. Never mind the story. That's not the kind of story that I want to talk about these traditions. But the point was that in looking for something quite different, I chanced to come upon a book which the title was a bit misleading, but it turned out to be a book by Gerald Hurd, a name that those of you who know Vedanta know that he was very close to Swami Prabhupada and the entire center in Hollywood, California. And though this was not a book on Vedanta, it was a book that dealt with mysticism. It was the first book I had ever encountered that presented the mystical view of reality as though it were true, not talking about it, but just presenting it as true. And from the soles of my feet, right all the way up through my being, I found myself saying, yes, yes, this was a different world from any that I had been made party to then. And it's the only time I've ever read all night. And when dawn was breaking, I had made 2 vows to myself. One, I would not read another line by this man until I had my dissertation firmly in hand. I obviously was afraid I'd never finish it. And second, when I did have it in hand, I would read everything this man had written. So I kept both vows, and having read the corpus of his writings, I then concluded this is someone I must meet. So I wrote to the publisher. I didn't know where he was. And some time later, I got a little scrawl note back from Gerald Hurd. The address on the envelope was Trabuco College, which is now in the hands of the Ramakrishna Vivekananda Order in Southern California. It said, you may have a little trouble finding me because Trabuco College is tucked up in one of the canyon, but I'll be very glad to see you. So I had no money. I was then teaching for 1 year in Denver before coming to St. Louis. No money, still in debt from graduate school, and I actually hitchhiked from Denver to Los Angeles and Trabuco College to see him. When I got there, I found I had no questions to ask. But that didn't matter. We went out and sat on a ridge overlooking the brown hills of Southern California, and it was well worth the trip. As I was leaving, he said 2 things. Have you ever met Aldous Huxley? No. I think I was 26 years old. No, I've never met him. Would you like to meet? Yes, I think I'd like to meet him. And so that was arranged, and that was wonderful. Walking the Mojave Desert with Aldous Huxley as he gave his reflections on the symbolism of the desert in the spiritual life, the sparsity, the absence of particularities, the nirguna aspect of the desert. And then the other thing Gerald Hurd said is, I hear you're going to St. Louis. There's a very good Swami there. Swami? I'm not sure I knew what that word meant. But my regard for Gerald Hurd was boundless. And so needless to say, I took note, and he wrote down the name, Satprakashananda. First week, we reached St. Louis. I looked in the telephone book, found a listing for an apartment in Del Mar, and I won't take time to go through that. Simply to say that to come upon that man was a marvel. I had met great scholars before, and Swami Satprakashananda was a great scholar. I've heard that many of the monks in the order who were more prolific than he was, though in the end he wrote a great deal, those who were more prolific would regularly send their scripts to local Swami to have the Sanskrit translations checked. A great scholar. I'd met great scholars before, University of Chicago. I'd also met deeply pious individuals, but I had never found the intersection between the scholarly solidity and the spiritual depth combined before in a single individual as I had in him. And as I had been assigned to teach a course in world religions that very year, this was right after World War II, and directives were coming down from college presidents to the effect that we had to globalize our universities and teach something in each department other than the sciences that dealt with the rest of the world, and I was young man on the totem pole, so I got assigned to it. But actually, with my budding interest through Gerald Hurd and Aldous Huxley's perennial philosophy, I was pleased with the assignment. But I was untrained. And I desperately needed help. And here, a stone throw away, was Swami Satprakashananda and the Vedanta Center. Well, to make a long story short, I apprenticed. And for virtually the entire time of the 11 years that I was here, I'd like to think of it as weekly tutorials on the Vedanta. It didn't come out every week, but as often as possible, as he laid down the basics of this staggering view of reality for me, and then at the same time did something unique in my experience, namely started me meditating. Now, since many in this room, this hall, know the Vedanta as well as I do, I'm not going to linger over it. I will just flag, as it were, the 3 points within it which burst upon me with a sense of excitement. The first was this marvelous openness to all the great historical traditions of the world, as this is set down in the beautiful metaphor of there being many paths to the same summit. That's a beautiful simile, but of course it's unpacked in many teachings. Ramakrishna's teachings are just so carry one along on this theme. I remember particularly, and those who are members of this society will know it, but one that I was particularly fond of was Ramakrishna's story of the devotee who was so partisan toward Shiva that he would never enter a Vaishnavite temple, only a Shivite temple, but God sensed that this was a bit narrow-minded, and so to teach him a lesson, many of you know the story, why as he was putting his flowers on the altar, why the deity changed its form from Shiva to Vishnu, whereupon the man snatched the flowers away and weren't in disgust. So the next time, since that didn't work, well, when the flowers were put, why the deity thought, well, we'll have to find other ways, so changed itself so half the form was Shiva and the other half was Vishnu, whereupon the man moved his flowers from the center away from the Vishnu over towards the Shiva, whereupon God said, this man's bigotry is hopeless. Anyway, the teachings of innumerable directions, that was the first element. The second was the 4 yogas, which now virtually belong to the world. The fact that we differ in our spiritual temperament, according to whether our long suit, so to speak, is reflective, in which case it's jhana yoga, the way to God through knowledge, or if we're more emotionally inclined, the way through love, bhakti yoga, if we're more actively inclined, the way of action or service, karma yoga, and then if we're the Raj yoga, if we're more experimentally inclined, the way of psychophysical exercises. Now, I've later come to see that all 4 yogas are in Christianity, but muted when we're told to love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, bhakti, all thy strength, karma, with all thy mind, jhana, with all thy soul, the spiritual exercises. That's the 4 yoga, but they're muted. I knew that first by heart, but the way in which the Vedanta sort of spelled out, sketched these 4 profiles. And what I came to see, something comes to mind. We were living on Waterman Avenue, and right in the house next to us, there was a young girl, a friend of, close friend of one of our own daughters, same age. And in the 2nd grade, it was discovered that she was having problems in school because she had poor eyesight, and she was fitted with glasses. And I remember hearing the report that after she was fitted with glasses, the first lunch she sat down to, she exclaimed with this discovery, said, peas aren't like mashed potatoes at all. They're little round balls. And I thought of that, and I still remember it because that's what I had the same sense of exhilaration when I hit the 4 yogas, you know. People aren't like mashed potatoes at all. Not one undifferentiated human glob. They have their definition, their distinctness. And what that teaching immediately showed me was that there is more than one mold into which we can pour our religious strivings. Specifically for me, I happen, for better or worse, to be more in the jhana yoga type. And I had been, through Christianity, had been pouring most of my spiritual energies into a bhaktic mold. And what this enabled me to see was it legitimated, you might say, my Christian Platonism, which the churches that I was involved with did not have much of an ear for. The third thing, and the last I'll mention, was the true excitement of coming to see the distinction between Nirguna and Saguna Brahman, or for those of you who are not familiar with the terminology, God with form or without form. Now, there must be something in God which is akin to us, or else we could not be related to him, her, it. But at the same time, it is crucial that there be regions of the Godhead or the divine which are definitely not like us, because no one can truly worship a God that is too human, because that becomes anthropomorphic. Well, the Christianity that I was involved with was so anthropomorphic, and keep in mind, that's a valid aspect. But it was not musical, you might say, towards the nirguna, the abysmal reaches of the divine that exceed the capacity of our finite minds to precisely discern. And the awe, the genuine awe that came to me when that dimension of the divine, Christian mystics call it the Godhead, beyond the God, came to view, this again was like a transfusion of energy into my religious outlook. Now, with that, I'll leave Vedanta and go to the second of the four, namely Buddhism. When I left St. Louis to go to MIT, it happened to be just the year that The Religions of Man was published. And at that time, just in that spring, NBC mounted a series of 16 half-hour interview programs Sunday afternoon, which they call the Wisdom Series. The idea behind it was we have Plato's dialogues and Aristotle's metaphysics, but wouldn't it be wonderful if we had Plato on videotape or Aristotle on videotape? Now we have the technology now. All we have to do is to look around and find out where are the Platos, where are the Aristotle. Well, that's what the idea of this series was, and the producers, in their own wisdom, concluded that not all, perhaps, of the world's wisdom was currently in the West, and so they decided to include a token Asian. And this token Asian was Daisetsu Suzuki. Somebody had shown Daisetsu Suzuki my book, The Religions of Man, and he liked the chapter on Buddhism, so when NBC asked, who would you like to interview you on this program, he very generously nominated me. And there began what came to be the opening out of the Buddhist tradition for me. Through Daisetsu Suzuki, I developed a keen interest in, you might say, the perennial philosophy in its Buddhist idiom. And that took me to Japan for Zen training. And now I'm going to slip into this format that will keep me from sprawling all over the whole evening. I said I would take one point from each of these remaining traditions, single it out as one of the points that just broke through on me with great force. And for Buddhism, I would say it's, to put it in one of their idioms, it is that the aim of Buddhism is to enable one to see things exactly as they are. Now, I want to flesh that out with a personal account of only one of the moments in which that point came through to me with great vividness. I was taking a group of students around the world for an academic year, studying the cultures as we moved around, and our last stop was 7 weeks in Japan. And I gave these 30 college students an option. Either they could spend those 7 weeks doing the usual academics, reading books on the religions and cultures of Japan, writing papers, taking an exam, or if they wished, they could take the experiential route and actually engage in the disciplines of some Japanese religion. 12 out of the 30 decided to go the experiential route. So I went to my Roshi. Actually, I knew the Roshi, knew he had died, but I went to his temple because I had a karmic association with that temple, having done Zen training under the former Roshi. And I met his successor and explained that I had these 12 students who wanted to engage in Zen training for the 7 weeks, and would he be willing to take them on? Well, he said he'd like to look them over. So the next morning, 10 a.m., typical Japanese scene, cushions on the tatami floor, a long table, 12 nervous students, one only a little less nervous teacher. The Roshi comes in, smiles and bows, and then speaks through an interpreter. This one, he did not speak English. He said, I understand that you are interested in Zen training. Why are you interested in Zen training? Well, you can imagine these students' first confrontation with a Roshi. Immediately they're asked a question. No one jumped in quickly, but the anxiety level rose. And there was one graduate student, so I guess he felt that it was incumbent upon him to speak for the group. So he did speak, and he said something like this. He said, for about 3 years, I have been deeply interested in the teachings of Buddhism. But on every side I hear that these are teachings that one cannot fully understand simply with one's rational mind. One must understand these teachings at a deeper level. And it's in order to try to attain that deeper level for the understanding of the teachings of the Buddha that I would like to undertake Zen training. The Roshi said, that is not a good reason to practice Zen. Actually, I was fairly proud of my student answer. I thought he had done rather well. But the Roshi said, the purpose of practicing Zen is not to understand anybody's teachings, not even the Buddha's. The purpose of Zen training is to come to see the world exactly as it is. Now, he said, we do not do that. He said, the mind is like a mirror, a round mirror. It reflects the things of the world. But the problem is that on this mirror, we have painted pictures of the things in the world. So, what we see is not the world. We see the pictures of the world that we have painted on our mind. He said, a young man falls in love with a young woman. Is he in love with that woman? Oh, no. He's in love with the picture of that woman that he has painted on the mirror of his mind. Oh, it's a very beautiful picture, but it is not that woman. And therein, Thoreau added, lies all manner of sorrow. He says it happens every day right here in Japan, just like it does in the United States. Now, he said, if any of you are interested in wiping from your mind these pictures of the world that you have drawn upon it, in order that you can see the world as it is, if any of you are interested in that task, you may come back tomorrow at 5 a.m. So, for Buddhism. And now let me go to Islam. Islam came late for me. 1969 or 70. The Religions of Man had been published 12 years or so. I'll just slip this one in. Once after a lecture, an elderly woman came up to me and said, Dr. Smith, you were very clever. You concealed it very well, your own personal religious identity, as you wrote those various chapters. But I see through you, Dr. Smith. You are a Muslim. And, that set me up no end, because if there was any chapter I had trouble writing, it was precisely that one. And so I took that as a commendation that I'd made it even on Islam. But so it was a marvel to me, really, when in 1969-70, I forget if it was the fall or early winter, in Iran, this was before the Ayatollah, before the revolution, I came upon the Sufis, the mystics of Islam. And I never would have gotten into that tradition without that. Because the mystics, as we know, speak a universal language. And because I was guided by local informants that I was exposing my students to the mystics, that I found, as it were, the heavens opening even above the Arabian land mass. Now, what can I single out as confining myself to one, as a treasure that came through to me from that tradition? And forced to choose, I think I shall cite the canonical prayers. Prayers are a part of all religion. But I had never come upon the concept that there are required times when, if you are going to consider yourself an adherent of the faith, you must pray. Now, I know that these are embedded. This is not unique to Islam, but none of the others had said, so to speak, right out loud, no ifs, ands, or buts, not only must you pray, but you must pray 5 times each day. And, not leaving it to that, went on to specify when you must pray. When you get up in the morning, when the sun is straight overhead at noon, when it is halfway down, mid-afternoon, at sunset, and before retiring. So that each day is punctuated. These 5 times with a withdrawal from the worldly involvement to establish contact with the divine. Now, Islam is the latest of the revealed traditions, and they have a saying, at least the Sufis do, that the reason these times are built in so non-negotiably is that with history, the acceleration of the pace of history, our tendency to get lost in the world is greater than ever before in human history. So much so that we need to have built in this kind of pulling us, grabbing us by the coat collar and pulling us out of our daily affairs at these particular stipulated points. And I freely confess that I have personally found that to be invaluable. The prayers that I say at those times are not necessarily the canonical ones of Islam, but I have ever since 1970 built into my daily regime those 5 non-negotiable times for prayer. If you're riding a bus or in a committee meeting or teaching a class, why, you can delay it until you're free. And if even when you're free in a public place, you can say the prayers mentally rather than out loud. But this framework, I have found, particularly in the busy life that I succumb to, as well as many of you, to be immensely useful. But let me also say that the content of the prayers, because in the Islamic content, it's not up to you what you say. These are canonical prayers where the content is given. And since they're short, I think I'll say them for you. And since there are 3 sacred languages in all the religions, only 3, Hebrew, Sanskrit, and Arabic. What makes a language sacred is that the canonical prayers must be said in those languages. So the world is full of Muslims who know no Arabic, but they all know the canonical prayer. Now, there are 7 short statements. And when they're put together, they're a kind of marvel, it seems to me, in the sense of how much they compact. So I think I'll say it through in Arabic, and then I'll say the 7 brief statements in English, so you can see the gestalt of the holy that they provide. In Arabic, it goes like this. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, Ya Rahmanir Rahim, Maliki Yawmiddin. Iyyaka na'budu wa iyyaka nasta'in. Ihdina sirata mustaqim, sirata ladina an'amta alayhim, ghayril maghdubi alayhim waladdallin. Amen. Praise be to Allah, creator of the world. So we start off by getting things in perspective. All of this that we're living through and spread before us did not happen by accident. It was a creation of an ultimate divine source. The merciful, the compassionate. And the Sufis, on that second point, Allah or God is merciful in creating the world and compassionate in drawing everything within it back to himself, herself, itself in the end. But now, just as things are in danger of getting a little soft and mushy as we think of what good hands we're in, comes the third phrase. Ruler of the day of judgment. Watch out. There are ways to go wrong. It's not a world in which anything goes. So be careful. And then comes the fourth, the pivotal one of the seven. Thee do we worship, and thee do we ask for aid. Now note two parts. And depending on your personal mood, you put the accent where you are at that moment. If things are going well, and you find the praise and gratitude naturally coming out, then you accent, thee do we worship. But if it happens to be one of those times that are hard, then you put the accent on this thing, and thee do we ask for aid. I need help. This one is hard. This one is tough. All the help I can get. And then the last three. Guide us on the straight path, the path of those on whom thou hast poured forth thy grace, not the path of those who have incurred thy wrath and gone astray. Amen. As I say, for 7 succinct statements, this frames life with a kind of economy and directness that still to this day seems to me to be a kind of marvel. Now, there's one last lap as I turn to the oral traditions. I had done some field work in Australia among the Tiwis, the Aborigines, but that was very brief. And in the main, my teaching and my research and my own readings had been almost entirely in the great historical traditions, where there is a cumulative record and great sacred text. And then in 1973, I moved from MIT to Syracuse University to join their graduate department. My teaching had been on the undergraduate before then. And suddenly I found myself 5 miles from the Longhouse, Hiawatha's Longhouse, the Iroquois, the Six Nations. And I had to take a kind of double take on that. And I started going out, first just to look around, and then I found myself more and more drawn in and hanging out with the chiefs there. And out of that final decade of my formal teaching, there came to me this really uncanny realization that in a way what I'd been circling the globe for all these years was here, right under my feet. not in any way that would take away from what I had gained or any regret that I had done that, but it was just the eternal gospel, the perennial philosophy, the Sanatana Dharma in these illiterate, if you will, people, but there it was. And if I were to pick out one thing again, for the sake of economy, that came through to me through that encounter with the oral tradition, the tribal tradition, is their sense of the sanctity of place. And when I say place, I mean geographical place. We've lost that, where we live in a society of rolling stones. We really have very little sense of space. We have a place. We've traded place for space, but space is abstract. A cubic foot of space is the same wherever it is, but place is concrete. And the way that point came through, and their emphasis in the tribal religions came through, I'll try to convey in a story a conversation that once happened with Chief Oren Lyons from the Onondaga Reservation. And I was out, and we were talking about these things, and he got onto this theme. And he said he was the first one from his tribe that had gone to the university. And when he came back at the first break, Thanksgiving, his father put him in a dugout canoe, and they went out into the middle of the local lake. And when his father had him thus positioned, why, he started interrogating him. Okay, son, you've been to college. You must be pretty smart by now. A question for you. Who are you? And Oren said, what do you mean, Dad? Who am I? I'm your son. Not good enough. What did they teach you? What do you know? Who are you? Well, I'm Oren. Oren Lyon. Come on. Who are you? Kept asking the question until Oren said he was just absolutely at the end of the rope, had no idea what he could say. And then, having maneuvered him into the spot of confessed ignorance, his father said, you see the bluffs there on the far side of the lake? Yes. Oren, you are those bluffs. And the pine trees on the bank, Oren, you are those pine trees. And this water that is under us, you are that water. This tightening up of the personal identity in terms of the region in which that life was shaped caused me to see a virtue in that worldview and outlook that we have severely lost touch with. Now, Swami, it's warm, and you said it'd be informal, so I will not try to wrap it up. It's been a long.
Some questions.
Yes, if anyone has some questions, well then please. If you don't mind, since my hearing is not good, I'll just walk down so I can be close to the right here.
position, I was wondering, how do you view the person of Jesus in relationship to all of this? Because I keep trying to be true to my own roots, and I keep getting confusion as I try to branch out.
Did you hear the question? How do I view the person of Jesus? Yeah. Well, within Christian theology, the second person of the Trinity has, you might say, multiple identities, but only in the sense they all cohere and coalesce. But there is the historical Jesus of Nazareth. There is the risen Christ. And there is the Logos of the Gospel of John. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God in the beginning. Now, I see Christ as that eternal Logos, since it is eternal and universal, because in theology the whole structure of the world derives therefrom as universal. And therefore it is not confined to Christianity. And then when we come to the Jesus of Nazareth, this is the embodiment of the universal Christ within this particular tradition. So the reason that I can myself manage, if we want to put it that way, Christianity and yet be open to the other traditions is to accent Christ as the universal Logos, which would have be indistinguishable by my lights from a reality which is present in other traditions by their own terminology. Yes, Shirley.
In relationship to God.
How do I deal with sin and salvation? The Dalai Lama was mentioned. Yeah, I brought him to Syracuse University once, and there was a question period afterward. Someone asked, what shall I do with my anger? And he said, control it. What I do with sin and salvation, I try to avoid it. What do I mean by the word God? Satchidananda, infinite being, infinite awareness, infinite bliss. Yeah.
Dr. Smith, thank you very much for your delightful talk. It's a real joy to be here with you. I am not a student of Thomas Merton, but I became acquainted with him through Seven Story Mountain, probably shortly after it came out. It had quite an effect on it, continues to as I reread it. Would you be kind enough to share with us some insights with regard to the context within which you
I'll be glad to. So you won't have to strain your necks. I'll come back here. Very privileged. I was with Thomas Merton in the last month of his life for 1 week. It was in Calcutta, a conference in Calcutta. And I went to that conference primarily because, though there had been some efforts to get to Gethsemane, some problems had arisen, and I thought I must go. And I'm glad I did, because before that month was out, he was dead. I, too, had been very taken with that man and his spirit. Fortunately, on the eve of arrival, I saw him in the beautiful cool of the evening in Calcutta, in the grounds of the hotel, sitting at a table alone, drinking an orangeade, and I went over. I'd only arrived, and there he was. And so we talked about this thing and the other, and I thought time is short, and here we're alone. So I said, Father Merton, there's something that I hadn't gotten to Tom at that point, but he did not stand on dignity, and it didn't take long. So I have a question that I said, I have a streak of the monkish in me, too, but it's not strong enough. For this incarnation, the other strand of the family life was more prominent. So I'll never know in this lifetime what, but I'm very curious. What is the life of a monk like? Not in terms of details of hours and routine. And to my surprise, he answered without blinking an eye, said, well, it's very nice. Somehow it was the burden, the discipline and the burden that sort of loomed in my mind. But the fact that he could take it so joyously, that was one thing. I think my two other memories, when it came his turn to speak, he, for the first time, donned clerical garb, and he said, as he stood up to speak, he said, I'm officially representing the Trappist order to which I belong, and therefore I feel constrained to wear that garb, whereas usually I feel more comfortable in blue jeans. But then he went on to say, I am here to represent the people of this planet who do not count. The monastic tradition and the poet. And his was the shortest of all the speeches, I think 8 minutes long. I think it's printed in the Asian Journal, but it was so powerful. Here to represent the people that don't count. And then he went on to say, and that includes the poor too, and even though we're taken care of, nevertheless, the poor and the monks and the poor are the people in this world who don't count. Beautiful statement. And then the third memory, we rode together side by side from Calcutta to Delhi, and I was on my way to the Dalai Lama, and he was on his way to Thailand. And he said, I envy you going to Nepal. He said, I've always wanted to take the 17-day trek from Kathmandu to, I forget, one of the monasteries that was at the western rim of Nepal. And so then we got into a playful mood. So I was saying, well, if you've always wanted to do it, let's do it. And it was September. I was taking time out of MIT. I had to work a lot to get free from that first week. So we could just, we fantasied. You just wire the ties and say, sorry, something's come up, and I'll wire my dean and say, fire me if you have to, and wire my wife, divorce me if you must, but Tom and I are going to walk these 17 days to that monastery. And it was a kind of joyous fun of this kind of fantasy. And then, of course, the news from Thailand. Now, I'm all right, but it's warm for some of the others, so whenever you think.
Yes, I was wondering what you would say about the recent vitalization of the Islamic religion in the West, particularly in England.
Yes. What do I think of the recent revitalization of the Islamic tradition in the West, particularly England. Well, this slaps over a bit to tomorrow morning when we'll be speaking about religion in the coming century. And I do think that there are signs of life throughout, not just in Islam, which are encouraging. Now, when you mention England, this conjures up the most visible representative, namely Idris Shah. And I don't know if you were thinking about him and his translations of Sufi tales in particular. But that is a special phenomenon, and though I have not met Idris Shah, I have some reservations. I think of it as a bit of a mixed bag, but there's no need to go into that specifically, I think, here. Yes?
You have spent many years in learning. You also had a head start. You came in as a Christian. Through all these years and all this knowledge and all this studying and writing, what conclusion have you come to about an afterlife?
Have I come to about?
Afterlife.
Afterlife.
Consciousness, serenity, lack of awareness, total awareness. What have you come to?
What is my opinion regarding the afterlife? Yeah, my opinion. Good. I'm glad we put it that way. Well, my opinion is twofold, but everything I say is subject to correction, Swami. You straighten me out if I make a mistake. No, I think that I do not think that our awareness comes to an abrupt halt with the death of our body. That's point one. Second, I am very cautious about trying to imagine the form in which this continuing awareness takes. I think that to try to conjure up previews of coming attractions, we might say, is not really very profitable, because what I suspect is that it is very different, perhaps in ways that we can no more now imagine than a dog could imagine what it is to use a rational syntax. So different that we perhaps don't have the equipment for imagining. Now, some visionaries say the opposite. You know, Swedenborg, who claimed to have visited the other world every night for about 40 years, according to his reports, the problem that the dead have at first is that it's so like Stockholm that it's hard for them to realize they're dead. Well, who am I to counter the visionaries? But let me say that my mind does not run in that particular track.
Yes, please.
Huston, with the Eastern religions, we talk so much about reincarnation. What is your personal belief in putting all of these beliefs together? How do you put them together to be personal beliefs in Western and Eastern traditions?
Now, let me say it back to you because I was coming down. How do I put all these together?
Or your personal Western and then Eastern traditions?
Yeah. All right. I once was at a social evening in England when a bit of this various history came out, and someone who was not much of a believer, an elderly man, said, "What a lot of nonsense you must have accumulated up there." Well, now, let me just be very direct. I can see that this can be, I know that this is a very real problem for many people, and I respect that. But I just have to report that there has been no problem. I've experienced, it's kind of strange to think about it, because these traditions are not carbon copies of each other. But I have had been thrown at no point into any inner turmoil about reconciliation. When I came upon the Vedanta, it in no way seemed like I was leaving Christianity as I was learning things that I believed in. I'll just give you a little vignette there. There were a few years where I was on the roster of University Methodist Church as an associate minister. All I did was preach one Sunday a month, but I was listed on their bulletin board and bulletins as a... When Christmas Eve would come, we would take our children to University Methodist Church and glory in the candles and the carols and all the pageantry, and it would be a very fulfilling experience. But when the children were put to bed, I would come to the Vedanta Society, where every Christmas Eve the Swami would give a meditation on Jesus Christ, the light of the world. And I just have to report that theologically, I receive more inspiration from the Swami's meditation on Christ than I did from the theology as it came through in University Methodist Church. I relate this simply to indicate that and then when I went on to the others, it was never a sensation of leaving what I had learned in the past. It was like learning another idiom, another language, you might say, wherein the same fundamental truths were expressed. Now, I've been fortunate on that. I sometimes wonder if anyone wants to, some of my friends think I'm a little sloppy thinking and don't sort of recognize a contradiction. But I think that the question is, sure, there are similarities and there are differences, and which come through to you as being the most important. And to me, it has been so clearly the similarities that I've been spared internal anguish. All right? Yeah. I should come a little closer. All right?
Incredible naturalistic beginnings for you as the son of a missionary, a Western missionary in China. And I was wondering, what do you think, how do you feel about then moving from that really near to the West in China with your father as a missionary, moving to the especially
How do I feel about it?
well, do you feel a movement that is strong that has led you from that time?
Well, I feel very fortunate. This is about my beginning in China, missionary parent, and how do I feel about it? I just feel very grateful for that heritage that I happened to grow up. And I did grow up in a very pious home, so the religious impulse center. I don't know if you can still hear me, but well, my parents, they had some little questions here and there, but truth to tell, I think at one point when I was becoming more interested in the great tradition, I think what they were really afraid was that at one point I might become a Catholic. Because there was a year when I had a lot of tutorials from Father Robert Henley at St. Louis University, because I had not been grounded in medieval philosophy very well, and nobody at Washington University knew it. So, go where the knowledgeable people are. And I think they got wind of that, and that was where their real alarm came up, but they took it all right. Yeah. Yeah? You may start talking.
What do you think of Catholic liberation theology, and what do you think Thomas Merton had to say?
What do I think of Catholic liberation theology, and what do I think Thomas Merton would say about it? I think Thomas Merton lived long enough to speak about it, and I tended to be rather for it. Now, I have not one but two things, and in a way they're kind of complement each other. That the church should be on the side of the poor and the oppressed, I think, goes without saying. I think that is true. And in that sense, I'm all for it. I do have a reservation, and that is that we live in and I'll be saying some more about this tomorrow morning, we live in an age where, for many, particularly of the younger people, liberal political causes are more important to them than theological truths. Now, I may do an injustice, but from some of the writings and some of the conversations in liberation theology, that if you ask if it came to a showdown as to a political program or a theological conviction, that more of themselves is invested in the former than the latter. Now, if that's not true, why then I have no problem with it. But sometimes, there's even one of them who said something that if the church and Karl Marx were to part company, he would go with Karl Marx. Now, it's that note that I do not resonate to, and if it's not there, then there's no problem in my mind. I don't know if you want to say something about it, because you may be closer to it and more involved in it than I am. Do you want to speak to that? Yes, please.
What would you say about the Lutheran
About the
Lutheran Buddhism?
Oh, Lutheran, sure.
Because the limit is even 5 minutes to the 9:30 almost.
The Nichiren sect in Japanese Buddhism, on the surface, has a political and intolerant thrust, which does not commend itself to me. But I have recently come to know some devotees of it that would have me understand that beneath those features of expressed in tolerance, that there are other dimensions which are much more, what shall I say, authentic and deeply spiritual. But that's a side of Nichiren that I have not gotten to. Again, I would invite you if you know something about it.
I don't know about that at this time, but there is a spiritual essence that, like yourself, I found when I became open to world religion, that I was able to say yes, 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 without question.
Right.
Are there fewer Christian mystics today than in times past? And if so, why?
Yeah. Are there fewer Christian mystics today than in the past, and if so, why? Nobody's really been keeping tally, so we really don't know, but we can venture. I suspect that there are, because again, we're getting over into tomorrow's subject. But I think that scientism and secularization has built up an ethos in which the West lives, which is not very welcoming of the mystical experience. Now, I think, and I shall say tomorrow, give some signs of change in that, but I guess I would say because of that, I would suspect that there are fewer today.
Thank you. Good night. We are very thankful to Dr. Huston Smith to share his wisdom and his adventure in world religions. And when I was listening, and what a great joy to listen. I can listen whole night. I shall never be tired. I shall not feel sleepy either. You know, sometimes I feel that way. To hear the Sermon on the Mount straight from the lips of Jesus, and to read the Sermon on the Mount, there is a world of difference. So when this type of persons, you know, with their encyclopedic knowledge, their humility, their love for wisdom, and when they share, religion becomes living. I always sometimes remind our people, don't try to understand God and religion through books. It does not work. I am living with the mendicants from the age of 14. I know how religion works. Now I was thinking that it is that woman could, dare to put a stamp on Dr. Smith that you must be a Mohammedan. But listening to his talk, nobody can put a stamp on his back that whether he is a Christian or a Jewish or Mohammedan or Vedanta. That it should be. Each person must be universal. That is our outlook. Anyhow, it is too late, 9:30. So tomorrow at 10:30, Dr. Smith will speak on religion of the 21st century. Good night, everybody.